This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Welcome all on this lovely morning. Thanks very much for being here, those of you who are here in person, and thanks, of course, as ever, to those of you who joined us online. You're equally as welcome, and I hope it's a nice, pleasant morning wherever you are, as indeed it is here in Dublin. So our session this morning here at the Institute is focused on the future of agriculture climate policy, with a special presentation of a newly published discussion paper for the Institute entitled Designing Agricultural Climate Policy in Ireland from 2030 to Net Zero by Professor Alan Matthews. It's a timely and important contribution, I think you'll agree when you get an opportunity to see it and to hear about it now shortly, to the national and EU level debate as we face into the difficult and I'm sure at times challenging challenge of reducing emissions in a sector that represents over 1/3 of Ireland's climate footprint. So before we begin, just a couple of quick notes for you. The session's on the record, the entire session's on the record, the presentation and the Q&A. You're encouraged to join in on X if you're motivated to do that, or indeed on other social media using the hashtag @IIEA. Most importantly, you can submit questions. So those of you in the room can just put up your hand the normal way, ask a question. If you're watching us on Zoom, you have the Q&A function that you know all about. You can just do that, use it. And as I say, with sort of, I think, boring regularity now to people on these sessions, if you have a question that occurs to you, just lash it in once it occurs to you, and we like to try to avoid questions getting bunched towards the end. It happens anyway, and it'll probably happen again today, but we can minimize that by people, if a question occurs at any point, just to put it in, and we'll get it then when we get to the end of the presentation. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. As you can see, in addition to Alan, we have a distinguished panel. First, though, and foremost, is Professor Alan Matthews, who will shortly give us a presentation on I suppose, the main arguments and proposals contained in his paper. Alan is Professor Emeritus of European Agricultural Policy at Trinity College Dublin. He's a former president of the European Association of Agricultural Economists and a former member of Ireland's Climate Change Advisory Council. His research focuses on the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, as it has for many years, global trade rules and food security. After Alan's presentation, we'll hear responses then from our two expert respondents. First, Niamh Garvey, who's Senior Policy Analyst at the National Economic and Social Council, the NESC, where she works on sustainable development and climate action. Before joining NESC, she was Head of Policy and Advocacy at Trócaire and has held roles with Christian Aid and the Institute of Development Studies, focusing on climate justice, agriculture and international development. And then we'll hear from Dr. Kevin Hanrahan, sitting beside me here, Head of the Rural Economy and Development Programme at Teagasc. Kevin is one of Ireland's leading agricultural economists. His research centres on the economics of land use, agricultural markets and climate change, and he's widely known for his work on policy modelling and the microeconomic impacts of agri-environmental reforms. So Alan's going to speak to us for about 10 or 15 minutes, either way. And then our respondents will come in then for about 10 minutes each, just kind of uninterrupted, as it were, just on their initial thoughts, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. So without any further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Professor Alan Matthews to present his findings and this paper. Good morning.
Well, first of all, a real word of thanks to all of you for turning out so early this morning, and also to those of you online, and particularly appreciative that Niamh and Kevin have agreed to respond to the talk. This is, in fact, the third paper in a series which we call the Pathways Project here in the Institute. And we've been working together with Matt O'Neill, who's the climate policy lead here in the Institute. And as I say, this is now the third paper of this particular project. The context is that we see global warming continuing relentlessly. I've just quoted some facts here from the most recent World Meteorological Organization State of the Global Climate Report. So last year was actually the warmest year on record in the 175-year observation period. Ocean heat content was also a new record high last year. We observe unprecedented glacier mass loss, and the Arctic and Antarctic ice sheets nearly at their lowest level. So, and all of that is contributing to the fairly devastating impacts of extreme weather that we observe both in Europe and around the world. So it's clear, we must redouble our efforts to reduce emissions, and agriculture and food systems have a key role to play in this, both globally, but also, of course, here in Ireland. So the idea behind this paper was that we need to sort of take a longer view. There's a huge emphasis, and quite understandably and quite rightly, on meeting our 2030 targets in the agri-food sector. But there's, of course, life after 2030. So the climate transition is not a sprint. It's a marathon, if you like, and we need to think about what we need to put in place also to ensure that we continue to make progress in the longer term. Now, we know that purely as a matter of an identity, we can only reduce agricultural emissions or tackle agricultural emissions in three ways. We can have technical mitigation options, which reduce the emissions intensity of our existing production. We can shift from emissions intensive to less emission intensive forms of land use. And to the extent that we will have residual emissions, we can offset those, I guess, most likely through nature-based solutions. And of course, we can discuss, the balance between these three pathways, and that's a matter for political negotiation, but not the needed direction of change. So in this paper, we're not trying to address this really important issue of, what is the likely pathway to 2050 for the agri-food sector, what targets should we be setting. Here, we're focusing more on the issue of implementation and the implementation challenge. We know that agriculture is struggling to reduce its emissions despite known and available technologies and practices. By 2030, the EPA tell us that agricultural emissions will be around 2/5 of our national emissions, and an even higher share of the emissions within the effort sharing regulation, where we have a binding EU target. We know that next week we're going to see the publication in Europe of the Commission's proposals for the 2040 target, and I guess there will be a series of complementary proposals for legislation, as we had with the Fit for 55 package for the 2030 target. And we need to start to think now about preparing the Irish position. So the argument is that we need to adopt a different mindset and to take this longer view. And just two charts just to indicate the challenge. So this is basically the story to 2030, which is the first two carbon budget periods. This is the traditional EPA way of presenting these data, with existing measures, that's the orange line, and with additional measures, which is the blue line. And you can see that if we just continue with the existing measures we have, we'll actually have more agricultural emissions in 2030 than we had in the base of 2018. With the additional measures that are under consideration, we can see the curve moving downwards, but not enough to actually reach the sectoral emissions target of a 25% reduction by 2030. If we take the longer term view, again, taking this graph from the EPA projections report to 2055, I've just gone up to 50 here. And again, you can see that if we have just existing measures in place, we will actually have higher agricultural emissions in 2050 than we had in 2018. So what the paper does, and it is now online, so you can read it over coffee. But we look first at the international experiences that we think are relevant. We look at California. California is interesting because it was actually the very first jurisdiction to adopt a specific biogenic methane reduction target. The reductions are driven by capturing methane from manure management and converting it to biogas. And the cost is, there's a grant element for anaerobic digesters, but the cost of this is basically met by the consumers of petrol and diesel in California, because the suppliers of these fuels are required to purchase the biogas in order to reduce the emissions intensity of their overall fuel supply. But having said that, although there has been progress in California, they are now looking at the possibility of introducing a methane regulation for livestock emissions, and we'll have to see whether that will come about later this year. We'd also look at New Zealand, which is the first country to have proposed including agriculture in an emissions trading scheme. We know that they have a national target, which is a split gas target with different reduction commitments for long-lived gases and for methane. And very appropriately for this particular talk, we had the talk by Simon Upton telling us about the New Zealand experience in the Institute last week. New Zealand went through an industry-led partnership which wanted to avoid including agriculture in the emissions trading scheme, and they came up with a proposal for a farm level levy rebate scheme as an alternative. However, with the change of government there in November 2023, the government has formally scrapped any idea that agriculture will be included in the ETS. Instead, they have put the focus on investing quite heavily in trying to develop new technologies, but they have maintained the commitment, and this is important, to actually price agricultural emissions from 2030. In fact, they're beginning that process by sort of standardizing the measurement of farm level carbon budgets in the next 2 years. And of course, the third example we look at is the livestock emissions tax, which has now been legislated for in Denmark, which will be phased in from 2030. A feature of the Danish system is this very significant rebate, 60%, which will cushion the impact on farm costs while maintaining the incentive to reduce emissions. As part of the package deal, it is a package deal, there's significant additional investment in new technologies, particularly in the Danish case, biochar, and also in terms of land use change. So taking low-lying organic soils out of production and an extensive afforestation program as well. To me, the Danish model is significant because it involved thorough preparation of this tax proposal by an expert group, worked for 2 years on this. That then went to a tripartite committee made up of stakeholders, farmers, agribusiness, local authorities, environmental NGOs, and they reached a consensus agreement on what the tax should look like. That then went to the Parliament, and the law was passed with very wide parliamentary support. Only 2 relatively small parties on the sort of right of the spectrum opposed it. I should add 2 further things about the Danish model which are important. One is that there has been significant additional funding provided, particularly for the land use change aspects. And the implementation is driven by local initiatives. So essentially, the country has been divided into 23 catchment areas. And in each catchment area, there is now a local tripartite group. So bringing the stakeholders together, and they have to develop the specific plan for their area in terms of land use change. That has to be completed by the end of this year. Last week was the first anniversary of the consensus proposal from the tripartite group, and there is extraordinary enthusiasm. I just have to say, I live in Denmark, extraordinary enthusiasm behind actually getting involved and progressing this particular proposal. So what we do in this paper is essentially suggest that we need an additional instrument in our toolbox, and that is a pricing instrument on emissions. So why would we look at this? So far, we have addressed climate action in agriculture, both through knowledge exchange, so basically trying to look at those win-win opportunities in the Chagos-Mack curve, which will both benefit climate and also farmers' bottom line. And then we have used cap subsidies to try to encourage the necessary behavioral change. But I would argue that relying on subsidies has inherent limitations. Generally, the subsidies, if we look at what we have, how we have implemented these, they are generally not results-based. Yes, in the biodiversity area we have examples, but not in the climate area. So the impact is uncertain. Generally, subsidy measures have multiple objectives, not least income support, as well as the particular targeted objective, climate change in our case. But this, of course, dilutes the climate impact. Subsidies rely on voluntary opt-in by farmers. So there are many reasons why farmers may not enroll in a subsidy scheme, even if it appears to offer an economic gain. My brother-in-law in Denmark is actually a farmer. He's retired now, and his land, most of it is rented out. But he was, because he is a landowner, he was asked to attend a meeting for his local tripartite committee, one of the 23 catchment areas, and to see whether his land would be appropriate to include in the sort of land use change. And he told me that, in fact, there were so many other landowners in the catchment that had already volunteered that he said he was going to wait and see. But his main constraint, he said, I just don't want to face the thought of filling in a sort of a 30-page form in order to claim a subsidy. That's just not for me. So you have these kind of behavioral impediments, if you like, if you totally simply rely on subsidies. Scheme enrollment is based on self-selection. This means that the farmers who enroll are those, in a sense, who have to make the least changes, and there's likely to be a strong risk of dead weight. And you can also have the possibility of a rebound effect. So our conclusion is that subsidies, of course, have a key role in supporting farmers in the green transition and in protecting farm incomes from the higher costs of a price on emissions, but they will be ineffective on their own. So then looking at the positive case for pricing emissions, essentially we are trying to convert what is in economic terms an externality into a tangible operational expense on farms. So it requires farmers to factor the cost of emissions into farm-level decision-making. I don't know how many of you listened to Countrywide last Saturday morning. I strongly recommend, it was a terrific episode with an interview with Donald Sheehan. Donald, of course, has been the driver behind the Bride project. Frank and I had the privilege of walking his farm some time ago. And there's an extract in that interview. I'm not saying Donald would necessarily agree with the proposal that we're making in this paper, but he says, look, I'm paid for producing fat and protein, and I have to meet a certain quality standard. But if I let nitrogen flow into the river, I'm not penalized. If I remove my hedgerows, I'm not penalized. But if I'm missing one tag of the 2 tags on my animals, my milk may not be collected. Where are our priorities, he asks. And that's really the issue that we're trying to get across here. We need to put a price on emissions to send that signal to farmers that this is a cost to the climate. We know that carbon pricing works. Just look at the emissions trading scheme in the EU. We know relative to regulation, putting farmers in control exploits heterogeneous abatement costs across farms, and it minimizes the overall cost of reducing emissions. It also exploits the behavioral economics insight, and Terry, I'm coming a little bit to you here, of loss aversion. So basically, as individuals, we respond much more to the potential loss of something than actually a gain of equal magnitude, even though the amounts are the same. But importantly, for the first time, this creates a business case for private sector investment in innovations for agricultural emissions reduction. How would we do this? Essentially, you have two main alternatives. One is a sort of carbon tax approach, including a levy to, as I say, absorb some of the additional costs, including a rebate to absorb some of the additional costs. Or you can go the route of an emissions trading scheme, what we call an ETS. In the environmental economics textbooks, the difference is summarized by saying that a carbon tax gives you a fixed price. Farmers would know what the price is, but it's uncertain whether you actually will meet any specific target at that price. Whereas if you go for a trading scheme option, you have it's a cap and trade, you have a fixed cap, so you hit your target, but the price is volatile. You're never very sure what it's going to cost you to actually purchase the allowances that you might need. There's a strong farmer preference for the levy rebate option. We see that in New Zealand, we see that in Denmark, and it's also administratively much easier. An ETS would add further risk and volatility with a farm-level point of obligation, and it's hardly administratively feasible with tens of thousands of farms. However, if we look at the EU debate, the EU appears to favor an ETS option, and this is mainly because of the unanimity principle for taxation makes the introduction of a carbon levy rebate scheme unlikely. The difficulty is that if you go the trading route, it leads inevitably to the point of obligation being moved upstream. So it's the fertilizer and feed companies that become the point of obligation, or downstream, it's the milk or meat processors that would have to pay the levy. And that creates a danger then that the ETS simply becomes a tax on production rather than on emissions, because it doesn't really capture what the individual farmer is able to do on their land. Of course, we need to acknowledge farmers' legitimate concerns, and I've mentioned 4 of them here. Concerns that carbon costs will erode their already thin margins, that it would lead to a reduction in production given the limited technological solutions, that there could be carbon leakage, particularly in an export-oriented sector that we have in Ireland, and also questions about administrative feasibility. But I would argue, and the paper goes into this in some detail, that we can design a pricing option to address many of these concerns. It's not that we are going to prevent change. We need to bring about change. So change should happen, but we need obviously to protect those who are involved in that change. And I kind of look at some of the, or I highlight here some of the options. We obviously need substantially increased investment in making technological options available to farmers. Any revenue raised should, of course, be ring-fenced and returned recycled back to farmers. You can minimize significantly any cost increase impact through the use of free allowances if you're in a trading scheme, or through significant rebates as the Danes have done. Of course, you need to give farmers credit for any sequestration that they may bring about on their land. And we need to support mitigation practices, particularly those that are not economically viable at market prices, with additional subsidies, just as we do for electric vehicles or for heat pumps in residential buildings. We need strong public support also for diversification alternatives. And that's not just a question of providing, a coupled payment for protein crops. It also means the creation of the necessary value chains, because farmers will not produce something if they don't see a market for it. There's implementation issues, but I think they could be overcome. We can also think about setting de minimis thresholds. There are indeed many technical issues which would need to be resolved, including relationship between climate and water and biodiversity issues. But to me, the apprehensions and so on can be addressed. So my final slide is just to kind of put before you our recommendation. Of course, this will require a political decision, and We can be skeptical whether that would be forthcoming or not. This isn't the first opportunity I've had to make a case for carbon pricing. In fact, I made this case to the Citizens' Assembly on climate action some years ago. And indeed, among the 10 recommendations that assembly made to the Oireachtas was indeed that with safeguards, a pricing scheme for agricultural emissions should be introduced. Now, the IFA in their response to that said they didn't have the opportunity to have the contrary case put to the Assembly. That's perfectly true. I had a bit of a free ride. But, you know, a bit like abortion and other difficult issues, you know, maybe the public is ahead of the policymakers on this. Maybe there are steps that we can take which, you know, are not going to be as politically damaging as our political leaders might think. How would we do this? I strongly recommend the Danish model. And as I say here, I see this as sort of 3 stages or maybe 4. Significant investment needs to be done in terms of addressing these technical issues. They need to be very well thought through before we would proceed with this. But we also need to roll out the efforts that Teagasc are already undertaking with AGNAV to get farm-level carbon budgeting. We then need a consultative process involving stakeholders like this tripartite committee in Denmark. With the terms of reference, this is what we want to develop. You make sure that the design addresses your apprehensions and concerns. And then, of course, we need the political decision-making at government and Oireachtas level based on what might come out. My concluding comment is we need to take action now because it will take time. This is something which would not be possible to implement before 2030, 2031. But as I say, we need to take the longer view. And with that, Alex, let me stop. I went on a little bit too long, but yeah.
And what I'll do is I mentioned earlier that we'll have 2 respondents, so I'm going to go straight to Niamh, if I may.
Thank you for the presentation this morning and fantastic to your paper and you're presented there. So I think it's a really welcome focus on the longer term. I suppose our carbon budgets have focused minds understandably on the initial carbon budgeting periods. And I suppose it's the mitigation options are so tight in the area of agriculture that there's so much focus on, I suppose, managing just the stretch to try and meet our targets, that I think that longer term perspective is really important and necessary. And I think that's sort of the perspective of the need for something transformative and what might be the type of instigation or lever or policy approach that could bring about a transformation is really, really important. And I think the paper makes a strong case for that being a pricing approach. I really welcome in the paper the focus on, I suppose, situating such an instrument within a wider just transition framing. And in particular, I think the critical emphasis on understanding and addressing the perspectives and concerns of farming communities in particular. And finally, really welcome, I suppose, that any proposed way forward would very much be done closely in collaboration, in consultation with a wide range of stakeholders. And I think the focus on both expertise, which may be economic as well as ecological, as well as, I suppose, farming representatives, as well as civil society. So that breadth of engagement will be really, really critical going forward. So I suppose there, I think I was asked to reflect on what I'd welcome and maybe where there might be, I suppose, some questions or issues that struck me. So I suppose one of the things that came out when NESC did a lot of engagement work with farmers and wider stakeholders as part of a process of developing a proposal around a just transition in agriculture and land use. And what we really heard from farming communities and rural communities was a high degree of anxiety, uncertainty, frustration, maybe changing policy messages over the years. And I suppose any new proposal or a new policy instrument, I guess, comes into that context. And I think, therefore, while there are the clear benefits around internalizing those negative externalities, which could go some way to realigning, I suppose, those mixed market and policy messages that farmers get, I think in the broader package, and the paper is clear that such an instrument will be part of a wider package, but I think a key aspect of just transition is that opportunities-led piece. What is it about a diversification of land use that can be attractive, that can draw farmers proactively into it? And I think in our context in Ireland, while we've seen, I suppose, changes to the forestry programme, we're seeing the biomethane strategy, I think there's still a sense among the farming community that they wouldn't be clear on what an alternative to some of the current models might be. And I think that sort of pull factor would be really, really valuable. I noted in the Californian case with the AD that linking into the energy markets, so that it's the petrol and fuel consumers who are paying in. What might an equivalent look like in an Irish context where we're seeing that diversification, the return on income that could link with the pricing. So just there's some initial kind of thoughts. One on just on the subsidies, I would say as well. I think you did mention the results-based payments. So I think there's also, in addition to maybe new instruments, I think some of the instruments that we do have, there's a lot of potential for improving the outcomes they can have, improving the benefits, both for farmers in terms of income support as well as environmental outcomes. I think we've still got a long way to go in terms of building on lessons learned through things like the EIPs, the BRIDE programme, and other really exciting ones. And Acres CP is obviously trying to scale that up. But I think there's a lot of learning from that initial phase. And I think there's a lot more maybe benefit out of how we're using public money in support of public goods on the environmental side. That would be great to explore further as well.
Very interesting. And I'll give Alan an opportunity in a minute to come back maybe on some of those points. But Kevin.
No, listen, really delighted to be here, everybody. And we had a short meeting before the seminar talking about this paper, and having written, if you've been involved in writing of MAC reports for Teagasc over the last decade and a half, we always finish them with saying all these measures can happen, but something will have to happen to make them happen. And in some sense, what Alan's paper and the idea is sort of putting firmly into the public domain the idea that we need to change the incentives that farmers are facing. And I think that's very welcome. And I think the conversation that hopefully will ensue will be about the devil that's going to be in the detail, because I think it will take a long time to figure it all out, I think. But I think it is welcome. And I think, I spent Saturday before last standing in a field in Athenry at Sheep 2025 in front of a board about a project called EU Life Green Sheep. And it's all about how we do LCA analysis for the sheep sector across the European Union in the context of improving its carbon footprint. And I had a box of protected urea and a box of CAN, two different fertilizers, one with a much bigger environmental footprint. And I was amazed by the positivity that I got in terms of talking to farmers about their willingness to do things to help the environment with the right incentives, right, with the encouragement. Lots of them had already used protected urea. They had no problem with the idea. Conceptually, it was very straightforward to them. They just needed some certainty about what was the path that they were going to be going on, and how would they be supporting the journey along that path. And in terms of our MAC work, we talked about pathways, and I think it's about giving farmers a perspective that goes beyond the 7-year cap horizon, because I think it's will have to be much longer. And I agree with Alan on that. We need to set out the parameters that will reward farmers for what we want them to do. And unfortunately, we want farmers to produce food, which comes with emissions, and we also want them to do other things like protect the environment, do things that are good for nature, for water. But we haven't figured out as a society yet how to reward them for those other things. And I think this is part solution to thinking about how we might structure those incentives, those rewards for farmers who are doing things that are better for climate. It's how we do that, which is going to be tricky, and also figure out how we simultaneously give them the right incentives to produce food that we want as European consumers and global consumers, and also to produce the kind of to contribute to the production of those environmental goods. But as a high level, I think it's not the first time we've talked about it. I was a member of various food vision groups that the Department of Agriculture convened, and this was discussed with farm organizations, and the idea of commissioning Alan to do a paper on it was discussed. He's done it for free, or the IIEA has paid him to do it, so that's very welcome. But I think it's in terms of starting the conversation about what we need to do to help to incentivize farmers to do the things we know that are technically feasible, but just need the economic incentives to get them done.
Thank you. It's very interesting. You know, you talk about goodwill that you've identified, and Niamh, I think, agrees, but also talks about uncertainties. And you come with perhaps relatively radical proposals into a context in which there is uncertainty, I think is the way you put it. And I wonder, Alan, I mean, I'm fascinated. We had a good chat actually over in Copenhagen a few weeks ago about the Danish model, and I'm just, ever fascinated by the processes that are in place in Denmark, perhaps uniquely even in Denmark. You mentioned national and local, the local tripartite requirement for discussion and agreement. And, I mean, we can't reinvent everything, but I sometimes think even when we look at our system of public policy making, that we know there are all kinds of silos, which is the word that we use. Even government departments, perhaps even the agencies sometimes, they have important roles. Some of them, they're set up under statute. They all work very hard. They produce some amazing stuff. But kind of picking up on Kevin's point, all the goodwill in the world and all of the expertise and all of the kind of positive approach and positive demeanor that people have doesn't seem to be pointing to huge progress, at least as yet, compared to somewhere like Denmark. I wonder, do you agree? And what might change that, or what? I mean, we can't change our system of government, our system of public policy making, but what? Would it be something like partnership, for example, that we talked a lot about 20 years ago? NESC obviously have good, strong views on that. I've been involved. I wonder what you think.
I mean, I think that's exactly the precedence to point to, Alex, that it's not a totally foreign concept to us in Ireland. I mean, we did have social partnership. It was extremely effective during the difficult economic circumstances of the 80s and so on. But that was still largely a national level thing. And I think what we have learned a little bit going through the land use review, which as I understand with the government at the moment and hopefully will be published soon, is that you need to decentralize this decision making. Now, how to do that, with our system of local authorities, which don't necessarily match the catchments. One of the points that Simon Upton made in his talk here last week was that in New Zealand, their regions actually do match rather well with their catchments, so they can actually build on that in terms of their land use change. But we have so many demands on our land, and this will come through, I think, when the land use review, the second part. I was involved in the steering group for the first, the evidence collection for the land use review. But what comes through very clearly is, we have a demand for more land than we actually have. So there are these choices to be made, and we need to somehow signal that, the more we can develop technical solutions for farming, the better. But it's not going to be the only solution, and we do have to diversify our land use. I really like what Niamh said in terms of focusing it on opportunities led, and I think there's a missing element there. I just think farmers aren't aware of what might be profitable paths to go along, and this is not only, as I say, a function for Teagasc to come. This has to be a bottom-up process. We need experiments to take place in terms of what might be appropriate uses for our land, whether it's for alternative types of food production, whether it's for non-food production, whether it's energy use or for nature or whatever. But yeah, I mean, we need to think about how we are using our land, and that can only be done at a local level. You cannot take decisions in Merrion Street about how our land is used.
Interesting. I'm going to keep an eye on our audience, so if anybody indicates at any point, I have two in mind. So what I might just do before I go to both those who've indicated, Alan, just on the on the question of a pricing system, and I think Kevin, or one or other of our colleagues was talking about just, the time horizons and how long should we be thinking about into the future to embed something like that kind of a change. And also then the other side of that question is what could be done more immediately? Is there something that could be done within 12 months? What are the first levers that need to be pulled?
It will take time. And that is the lesson of international experience. I mean, if you look at the New Zealand model, they have been discussing this since probably, Frank, you probably will know better than me, but going back to 2013 probably. And there's many very good reports looking at how you would design a system, first bringing agriculture into an emissions trading scheme, which proved to be highly unpopular, and then a stakeholder partnership approach, which actually came up with a farm level carbon levy rebate scheme, which fell at the last fence, and you can look at the political economy reasons why that happened. But nonetheless, as I stress, the current New Zealand government is still committed to introducing a pricing scheme by 2030. Okay, and that's still 5 years ahead. What can we do now? Well, I mean, if this is a path that we think we should go on, we do need to have this technical preparation work. And of course, that would include stakeholders, but it would be largely your technical experts, your modelers and IT people and so on who would need to be involved. But what the New Zealanders are doing is with that, keeping that 2030 target in mind, and they want a farm level system. Of course, the first thing you need to make sure is that farmers actually can measure their carbon footprint, because that's what they're going to be the levy on. So they are actually rolling that out over the next 2 years. And I indicated that the first step in that is to actually, I mean, I understand about 80% of farmers in New Zealand already use a carbon calculator app. But there are 10 or 11 of these on the market, and they will all give you different results. So you choose the app that is most favorable to you. Obviously, that isn't going to work. So what the New Zealand government, the current New Zealand government, in other words, the one that took agriculture out of the ETS, what they are doing is they are coming up with a standardized calculation, and they are going to insist that all carbon calculators use that standard, and that you can do immediately, because it is important. If we can't measure what we are trying to address, it's clearly we can't manage it. So that's the first step, and you can do that straight away.
Niamh?
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree, because I think there's many reasons why we need that good data, right? So I mean, here we're talking about it as maybe supporting a pricing instrument. There's already obviously the good starting point with the Origin Green and the AgNav work for its own rationale of how we, I suppose, the claims that we make as we sell our food internationally. The carbon farming initiative is something that is under development, but we also have public agri-environment schemes which are shifting in some cases to results-based payments. We have maybe future land use planning changes. We've got, I suppose, commitments to natural capital accounting and ecosystems. There's many benefits. I get this core data of how our land is being used, the emissions related to it, water quality, biodiversity, etc., are all core to so many different processes that I think that investment in them upfront and now it will reap benefits for multiple, I suppose, policy initiatives, and therefore the possible costs incurred, are shared across, I guess, many policy outcomes. So I mean that to me is one of the starting points, but not then to lose sight of the opportunities piece. I think, and we've mentioned a couple already, but another that came up a lot when we were engaging with farmers and other stakeholders, given, I guess, some of the constraints and concerns around maybe sort of traditional approaches to forestry, areas like agroforestry and silvopasture, there was a lot of openness and interest in those kind of approaches because you can continue to produce, within and around the trees. But it's not an area that's very familiar to people in Ireland. So farmers were interested, but didn't feel they knew a lot about it. So I think there's maybe various avenues, and it might from, let's say, a long-term resilience piece, be about layering a few different possible income streams rather than maybe the one single kind of approach.
Okay, I will come to Kevin. I saw him nodding there as well, but I'll come back to you. I'll take two from the audience. Please give us your name and your designation, and away you go, the gentleman at the end there. I will take the two together. Take Frank after that.
Oh, Charles Lamb, an engineer that's been in the food industry for 60 years. And I've had a look at the question of methane and so on. But if I look at your graph, you have two graphs there with available existing measures and with additional measures, but you're missing the most important one. With the best possible technology, there should be a third line on the graph that actually shows what is possible, technically possible to do. The same thing applies if you're talking of your energy in the electricity generation. We should have a clear line as to what is best possible practice, which is over 90% efficiency if it was combined heat and power. And we put in stuff that's only 37% efficient. And if it's fired with gas and it's liquefied natural gas from fracked sources, it's 40% less efficient again. So, but the thing is that we've got to face up with honesty to things that have maybe been done without being the best practice, and not to blame people for making decisions which they did in good faith, but to face up to the fact that if we put slurry from cattle under slatted sheds, the methane comes off and is wasted. Whereas if it is captured immediately, you can reduce the methane emissions by 97% if you capture the methane and burn it as useful fuel. And we've really got to optimize the collection of methane from unwanted or unneeded organic material, whether it's brown bin waste or what it is. We've got...
No, sorry. Did you want to finish? Sorry, I beg your pardon. I didn't want to interrupt you, but just to move to Frank.
So
basically, very interesting insights.
Basically, we have to go into the nitty-gritty of details, of proper calculations, and avoid spin, and that we really are testing things against the best known technology in the world. Thank you.
Appreciate that very much. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Sorry, Frank Convery from ECD. I think, I love this presentation, but to me, the most important underlying context is international learnings, basically. And I coordinated the research network for the emissions trading scheme back in the day in Europe. And the most important thing there, by an order of magnitude, was the discovery that the Americans had created a trading scheme with acid rain. And essentially the EU ETS that we ended up in was basically 90% cut and pasted from the ETS. But the transfer of that knowledge and the granularity of it, of course, takes deep engagement with people who've done serious ex-post analysis, the civil servants, the industry, that whole world there. So I think the most important piece of this paper is the anchoring of a lot of the discussion, what other people are doing. Unfortunately, we don't have a template like acid rain to cut and paste, but the plan B of that is to extract pieces from other jurisdictions, which is what this paper attempts. For example, in California, the most interesting piece of the California effort is the call for tenders they make to farmers and industry to reduce emissions. And it's basically a tender document that judges award of the subsidy, and I accept Alan's narrative about the weakness of it, but it bases the subsidy on value for money and technical expertise. So you change the dynamic completely. If you just take that little piece of the California narrative. So just going ahead, I'd really, and Denmark is just an amazing place. I see the Danes, I mean, their dairy production is only about 65% of ours, so they're smaller in volume terms. But I see them having a narrative 5 years from now where their milk and their milk products have a much better carbon footprint than any of the competitors. They have a narrative that they're cleaning up their water and they're reversing the decline. And they have a narrative that nature is, and the fact is there are premium markets in this world. You know, we get almost twice the price of German competitors in the German market today. We get almost twice the price for our milk in the American market as competitors do. So I suppose my message is to keep digging deep and learning the granularity of what we can take and drive. The secret of the Danish model is ownership, I think. They found a way of having farmers and landlords, the whole system owning, and the secret seems to be the 23 catchments where they're anchoring not the climate piece, but the water and the nature piece. And anyway, I think this is really exciting, and I would encourage that granularity of exploration of learning from pieces from our own thing.
Thank you very much, which is exactly what we want, the contribution we want to make here at the Institute is to facilitate exactly that kind of learning. And Kevin, I was going to, I don't know if you have any thoughts based on what you've heard, but I know that Teagasc have done a lot of modelling, you know, and particularly, for example, on the abatement potential at the farm level. And I'm wondering, does the paper, you know, does the paper reflect that? Do you think, are there any thoughts on that aspect?
I think the paper made the right decision not to go deep into the weeds.
Okay.
So it doesn't talk an awful lot about that. But it kind of says, okay, that stuff is very valuable, but like it isn't happening at a pace that we need it to happen at in terms of practice adoption and change at farm level. I think we have a body of work, and we had some PhDs working on this in terms of thinking about the marginal abatement costs at the micro level, because the benefits from a cap and trade or a system come from the heterogeneity in those costs, and it's clear they're not all the same across farmers in Ireland, and they're not all the same across the European space. So there are benefits to how we use our carbon budgets in terms of producing value added or food per ton of emissions. In terms of the point Charles was making about best practice, I think look at the Teagasc map or look at the work we did for the Climate Council. That was where, you know, everything happens, and it happens almost to the maximum extent possible. And there is enormous potential. I guess the challenge is translating that potential, technical potential, into actual change in terms of what farmers are doing on the ground, what food industry is doing on the ground. And I think that's where the challenge is, and that's where Alan's paper and the idea of, you know, a levy and rebate system or a cap and trade system actually comes in to say, okay, we know we have an idea of what's technically feasible, but we need to figure out how to make it really feasible in terms of what happens, because we've got 130,000 farmers out there. The processes we're talking about addressing are, in some sense, they're biological processes, and they're really complicated. And it's a whack-a-mole problem. All of a sudden you start to address this thing and it pops up somewhere else. So we need to think. There's been a lot of thinking done, but I don't think we're finished thinking yet.
Ono Mahdi is a policy analyst in the Department of Taoiseach, and he has a question which I won't put directly to you, Kevin, and you'll understand why. If land use is to be managed locally and not centrally, does the panel have suggestions about which agency or authority might coordinate these processes? So it's just an interesting question if there is to be that kind of...
I think I spent some Christmas reading that book about the land wars that Miles Duncan published.
Oh, yes,
and learning an awful lot about stuff I didn't know about.
Yeah.
But I had an experience in my own locality, which is in the southern part of Galway. And the Dublin to Galway Greenway was going to be coming through my townland, and I was thrilled because I would allow my kids to cycle to school and me to cycle more safely to work.
Sure.
But most of my neighbours didn't see it like that. Yeah. They saw, this is where we live. Why would we want people from outside coming in here? Like, sure, we wouldn't know what they'd be doing. They'd be cycling by, and sure, they could do anything, right? So it brought home to me that those questions of land control and community, you know, they provide the opportunity, but they also present barriers to change.
And our political system, doesn't it? I say this with some experience of it. Our political system is better geared to objection than it is to promotion. And that's not necessarily to say that there is no basis for people to object. Of course, there very often is. And we have a planning system and we have an infrastructure to facilitate people to bring forward their views in a democracy as to something that they see being proposed that they don't want to see happening. But the point is, we're better at that part of the operation than we are at the facilitating of the promotion of the thing. Niamh is nodding, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the land use review has just come up, and as part of some of the processes under that, the Citizen Engagement Working Group, which I was a member of, did some research into what is working. So where have we seen good examples of land use change in Ireland? And a lot of the, some of them are community-based, you know, the community peatland stuff. There is the some of the LIFE programs, the European Innovation Partnerships, and there was lots of examples where maybe things that were tricky enough land use changes were achieved in a way that everyone felt very positive about. And core to that was that engagement piece. And the flexibility of taking a context-specific approach. And while they aren't maybe structures that sit in an existing sort of hierarchy from national to local governance, there were really exciting multi-stakeholder groupings at sort of catchment or local levels. And it was that interplay of the different perspectives together. So ecologists with agricultural advisors, with low pro water people, with local communities that could do a lot of that policy coherence at that localized level. And I think the restrictions there, I guess, is that many of these projects would be relatively short term, up to 5 years, maybe have a limited scale and scope. So the question is, how do you scale all of that positivity into, I suppose, our more normal system of governance? And I think that's you know, an exciting challenge for us as land use review.
I beg your pardon. I might just mention that Tom Ferris, an economist and is an IIEA life member, was just asking, he wanted to hear more about the NESC report on just transition in agriculture and land use that you mentioned. I'm not going to ask you to elaborate on that now. I'm just telling you that Tom Ferris is very interested in it. And there's going to be a discussion about that. There's a gentleman down the back. I'm going to take, I can see 3 hands now. I might not be able to take much more than that. I would appeal to everybody, name and designation, and try and keep it tight, and we'll get to it. We'll get to everything.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Nisha Umri Tachtadala,
very welcome.
Elected, thank you, elected for the North Side. And also Cahirlook of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate, Environment and Energy. And first, I object to your characterisation, Alex, of the political system as being very, very good at objecting. How's that? That was my point. This lady wins the prize.
That was the first, in case anybody missed that retort, the woman in front said, that's the first objection.
Just a couple of questions. Thanks very much for the work and the paper. Can you tell us a little bit in terms of the unit? The Danish proposal is interesting. I don't know a whole lot about it. What unit, what's the unit that the Danes are planning to price it? Is it kind of heads? Is it livestock? Is it head of livestock? You might, I'm sure their work, that may be worked out already. I don't know. You might be able to say a bit about that. In terms of the LULUCF, are they doing anything in, you know, we seem to be a bit behind there in Ireland. Are they doing anything in particular or of interest in LULUCF? In terms of catchments, you just referenced catchments. Are they water catchments, or are they some other class? Are they local authority catchments? What's the definition? And then just the gentleman, sorry, I didn't get your name from Agos, Kevin. Just in terms of bringing agriculture and food along on this journey, that's always an interesting. Any thoughts or comments?
On it. I mean,
what's that?
I think agriculture and food are on the journey.
Well, let's hear a bit about that then, because it would be good to hear it. Thank you. Thank you. Alice.
Right there. Yes, you're welcome, Nisha.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Noel Barden with the Irish Farmers Journal. I suppose on if you're to actually implement either the ETS or kind of the levy system, like there'd be quite significant stumbling blocks. So I suppose land use is one of the things that was mentioned, and for many farms, particularly those maybe in the west of Ireland, their land use emissions could potentially dwarf what are their livestock emissions, their fertilizer emissions, just with the nature of the land. And I suppose it's an area where the research, it seems every 6 months that there's a new paper out that the emissions are more than we thought, less than we thought, and not by 4%, 5%. They're either half of what we thought or double of what we thought. There is quite a lot of uncertainty there. I suppose, would you actually be able to, with confidence, kind of tie land use into any of this emissions pricing? I suppose another point would be, could this blinker farmers towards emissions? So farmers, if they're faced with a decision on the farm and they might just your standard agri-environmental scheme, they might just have a look at the list and pick something which will be kind of geared towards kind of ticking a few boxes. Are farmers just going to be looking at emissions now, and could they see other kind of environmental issues like their impact on water quality? Well, I don't have a direct stake in my farm's contribution to water quality, so I'm kind of going to throw that to the wayside and focus on the emissions. And I suppose it'd be interesting to hear as well, either with New Zealand or Denmark, what kind of account was taken for farmers who might take an early action on emissions and whose emissions are already quite low. They don't have that much low-hanging fruit there, because surely when either you're bringing in an individual emission ceiling for a farm or determining what the levy rebate is going to be, there's going to be some kind of a 2-3 year window. And maybe if you were kind of doing the right thing all along, but your neighbor wasn't really, your neighbor might have a bit of wiggle room there to reduce their emissions to lessen the impact of whatever the new system is being brought in.
Okay, thanks. Some brilliant questions now, fantastic insights. We're not going to be able to hope to get to answer all of them. I'm just going to invite the panelists to bank as much of this as they can. I'll be giving them a final roundup. We're really up against it time-wise. We only have another less than 10 minutes. So pick and choose from what you've heard in your final remarks, but we won't be able to answer every specific one. But John, over here, please, before we go to the panel, I was just urging the panel to do that, but I was always going to come.
I'll be brief, Alan. Yeah, thanks very much.
So great to have you here.
Alan, I think I would welcome your proposal for carbon pricing, because ultimately it's rooted in the polluter pays principle, which I think is central to many of the issues that we're discussing today. Looking at your graph of the EPA, it's quite clear that we're looking at 10 years of failure of agricultural policy in Ireland to reduce emissions. And that's the reality, which I think any suggestion to tackle is very important. But going back to Alex's point about time is very important here, because tackling climate change is not a marathon. I would disagree with you on that. It is a sprint. And it's a sprint because effectively what you're showing in those graphs is that we will enter 2030 with a vastly reduced sectoral budget and carbon budget nationally as a whole. So it's an emergency to tackle that. My main question, which I'd like to just ask you, though, is that a trading system rewards the efficient people and drives the inefficient people out effectively. And in this case, I would worry that what you're proposing here will benefit the very big farmers and will perhaps victimise, in a sense, the family farms in Ireland. Now, we have a situation where in 2025, the average dairy farm income will be €122,000. That's the average. So we're going to be, in a sense, dealing with people on both sides of that. And I would worry that perhaps the trading system might not handle the importance of the family farm. It also, I don't think, handles the technical issues. The technical issues are not merely externalities in this case. Biodiversity, water quality, these are core issues rather than technical issues. And I think they have to be placed front and central. And important in that is the role of civil society. And civil society has been more or less absent from consideration in the agricultural plans we've seen from Food Harvest 2020 onwards. So I think these are the issues that I think the plan has to tackle in some way.
Alan, do you mind if I go to you first on that?
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for everybody for a really interesting set of questions. Can we have another hour?
No, I don't. Well, I'm conscious that people have commitments, so I mean, we can certainly take another 5.
No. Very quickly, the unit of tax in Denmark is the emissions, so it's the actual per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that would be taxed. So it's not on production; it's on the emissions. LULUCF is not included in the tax system; it's only on livestock emissions. There is a huge effort to First of all, take low-lying land, which is equivalent to our organic soils, out of production, because Denmark has a huge water quality problem. It's more in the fjords rather than in the rivers as we have it here. They are going to pay farmers. It's a voluntary scheme. They will pay farmers to do this, but it will be done through these local tripartite groups, and local authorities have appointed what might translate as engagement officers. So these are people who are now going around and talking to farmers and trying to find out, you know, what land would you be prepared to put into this scheme, and it obviously has to work at a catchment scale. You can't just take an individual field and do it. So there's a lot of momentum behind that at the moment. And the catchments, to be honest, I'm not too sure. I think they're water catchments, the 23, but that's a question. I just don't have the information to answer you fully. I didn't catch the name, but no, sorry, no. Lots of very worthwhile technical issues there. I certainly understand your point about the emissions factors, particularly on the land side, seem to keep changing. What I find interesting is that we are prepared to you know, we're quite enthusiastic about carbon farming, which in a sense is a market-based approach because it's going to pay for results. It's not just paying farmers to plant cover crops, or it will actually pay for the measurable increase in carbon that you can have. But actually, that is the area with the most uncertainty. I mean, that we've seen how the forest figures have dramatically changed in recent years. So if we're prepared to actually start implementing carbon farming, and I'm fully behind it, but you know, the uncertainty levels there are much greater than they are for certainly for livestock emissions, and I would say the agricultural soil emissions are probably somewhere in between. And again, the question on the early adopters is really important in the carbon farming side, because the carbon farming is built on the concept is the voluntary carbon market, because the hope is that we will get private money coming in to supplement public payments. But private money will only pay for additional carbon. Okay, they're not going to pay farmers to maintain carbon that's already there, and that's where you get this tension between additionality and penalizing the early adopters. Because if you're an early adopter, you've already done, you're not going to get additional, and therefore you're not going to get carbon credit. Well, I mean, there is a baseline approach which is supposed to address that, but it leaves a lot of scope for flexibility. But when it comes to the pricing scheme, Noel, this is automatically taken into account, because if you were to include the land use in your pricing of emissions, and as I say, the Danes haven't done that. They have just looked at livestock emissions. But if you were to include the land use emissions, then the early adopters would clearly benefit, because they would already have a lower, either higher sort of offset. But these are the sort of technical issues that why I really think we need that expert group to spend a couple of years just teasing these out, if this was the way we were going to go. Let me stop there. John, yeah, sprint and marathon, I understand exactly where you're coming from. And I think it was also Noel, you made a sort of similar point, that if we were to bring in this, which is purely a focus on climate, how does that link with some of the other challenges, particularly water, biodiversity, that we face? I mean, my answer to that is you can't really have one instrument that is going to address all of these issues. You know, we need multiple instruments. You know, we need to have a sort of a separate way of addressing the water issue, and similarly with the nature restoration and biodiversity. So to say that we can, they have to work in synergy.
And you did make the point that you were apprehensive that a carbon price would essentially benefit the larger farmers and discriminate against the smaller guys. To be honest, I'm not sure I can see that. I mean, we know, I think the Teagasc figures would be that dairy farms per farm have the largest carbon footprint, so they're going to pay the most money in this. And if you have a lowly stocked, dry stock farm, you know, with extensive stocking rates, you're not going to pay very much. And you can do a lot with this rebate. So, you know, this is part of the design options. Where you would rebate, your design of your rebate might be on you'd give a standard rebate per animal, so that the heavily stocked intensive guys, they would get relatively less in the rebate than the smaller extensive, because the rebate would be a uniform figure across all farms. And relatively, the smaller guys would actually benefit more. So you can do a lot with the design of the scheme to address the very legitimate concern that you have. Yeah,
Kevin, I will go to you next, and then I think in the paper you talk about like having or thresholds above which farmers would have to be in the scheme and below which farmers might be voluntary. And I think you can take an awful lot of the dry stock farmers out of the scope of the initial ETS. If you set a threshold of 20 livestock units, you know, as being one where you weren't in it, like it's like 50,000 of the cattle farms might be outside of the scope of the scheme because they're so small. In terms of what Teagasc is doing to the Teachtaí Dálas, I mean, we're doing a lot, and I think we obviously have more work to do if you don't know about what we're doing in Teagasc and across the agri-food sector. Signpost Farm Initiative is demonstrating what these technologies and farm practice changes can mean on a real farm, both in terms of their environmental impact and their economic impact, basically telling the story of how farmers can walk that path that we're trying to persuade them to be on. And that's supported by industry partners in the food processing industry and by the Department of Agriculture. We're developing the AgNav platform, which the objective of which is to give every farm in the country detailed information about what their carbon footprint is per unit of product, but also for their farm in terms of tons of CO2, and what we are telling them to do could do for that footprint or for that farm story that they wouldn't be telling to their buyers, and what they can tell themselves to the people who supply them with inputs in terms of what they want to enable them to have lower emissions. So I think Teagasc, together with its partners in the agri-food sector, is doing a lot. In terms of the inventory, it obviously is not enough yet. I mean, there's more to do. It's unfortunately a classic story. And I think we just need to, with Alan's and Matthew's work, is kind of saying, okay, we need to have a conversation about how we can restructure the incentives that farmers face, because they are not facing the incentives to do all the things that we've been talking about for the last 10, 20 years. And we can spend the next 10 or 20 years redoing the MAC curve and not actually making enough progress. So I think that's what my message is.
This issue of pace of change seems to it recurs all the time. I wonder if John Sweeney just reminds us, you know, the point as between marathon and sprint, and I think he's right to remind us of that. I think, what would be your kind of closing remarks? You won't be able to cover everything.
No, I'll just pick up on two. So Noel and John both referred, I guess, to the importance of biodiversity and water quality. I think that's absolutely critical. And I think it's really interesting as Ireland's developing its carbon farming. That's a shorthand for carbon and nature farming. So Ireland's really trying to bring in a more holistic approach to thinking about the development of that approach. And I would come back to, let's say, the centrality of measuring data at farm level for these multiple purposes. So if we have good measurement across water, emissions, biodiversity, etc., your public payments, like the scorecards do under acres, can be rewarding good quality as it exists now with public money for public goods. You can layer on top then private money for additionality and maybe pricing mechanisms. So if we get the good data at the core, allows maybe a more coherent approach for multiple policy instruments to reward and potentially penalise farmers, you know, but in a coherent sense. And then final point, to pick up on John's point on the importance of that civil society voice, I think those multiple perspectives are absolutely key. And whether it's at the expert level, it's having sort of ecologists in the same room as economists, and then at the sort of, you know, stakeholder level, it's civil society, rural communities, farmers. I think it's when we have the truly multiple perspectives that we get the best solution for wicked, tricky problems. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just on the broader European context, Niall Monaghan works for the Australian mission to the European Union. And just by way of a comment, he says it seems Ireland is thinking, he had it initially formed it as a question to you, Alan, but I'm afraid we're out of time. But he says it seems Ireland is thinking about this a lot. Denmark has moved. Netherlands is stuck on the fence, giving political issues, according to Niall. And he's wondering who else in the EU is making noises about more ambition. France, for example, Germany. So these are questions that, I mean, we're going to leave the room here with a lot of, as many questions ringing on our ears as we are answers. But I just want to thank everybody for your participation. As Alan kindly pointed out, this is the third of a trio of papers that we've been delighted to work on and to publish. The first, From Policy to Pasture, Bridging the Gap Between Climate Targets and Irish Agricultural Realities. Second, Farm to Finance, the Processor-Farmer Nexus in Ireland's Agricultural Climate Transition. And then the third, this paper, as Alan points out, it's on our website now. It's hereby published and it's available for all to see. It's our Pathways trio of papers. Thank you all very much for being here today. Thank you in particular, if I may say so, to Alan Matthews for his immense support and leadership for this project. We couldn't have done it to the level of excellence that we have. It's been absolutely indispensable and critical to it. And thank you for your willingness to help us, give us the insight, give us the leadership, and to write some of the paperwork as well, and papers, and to work with our colleague, Dr. Matt O'Neill here in the front to produce these papers, which I think are at a very, very high level of excellence. So a particular thanks, if I may, to Professor Alan Matthews. All of the stakeholders, and I'm conscious of the issue that, you know, what are the work, we certainly have had a great opportunity to see and to understand the work that's been done across many sectors. So the state agencies, the government departments, we've had three, I think, between Taoiseach's, Department of Agriculture, Department of Environment involved in our stakeholder group, the various agencies, the NGOs, the representative bodies, the Irish Farmers Association, Marco na Ferma, the research institutes, agribusiness, also really important input into our deliberations. So that stakeholder group that we've sort of built around this process, I think, has been immensely helpful to it. It's deepened it. We've been able to get feedback from what the various stakeholders think, and as best we can incorporate that in the work, that we've been able to produce. So we're hoping this is the start of a process for the Institute. We really want to continue a focus here in the Institute on these issues, and to be some kind of not to be the kind of new partnership model or anything, but that would be too ambitious, but to make some kind of contribution. And it's really great to have political people here as well, and to have many experts in the room, that we could continue that process, so that we can be a forum to have really, a deep deliberation at an informed level, which is really what our aspiration was on this. Thanks to my colleague Matt O'Neill, as I've mentioned. We do want to continue this process. Thank you all for your support. Thanks also to the European Climate Foundation for their support for this project also. So that's really where it is. We're well over time, but I think we've plenty more we could continue with, but people have other things to do. Thank you very much.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.